You really think you can just sit there and look at your screen while I am trying to clear the aisle? Ah! I said give it to me! You aren't a queen, sweetheart. You're just another passenger who needs to follow instructions.
You really think you can just sit there and look at your screen while I am trying to clear the aisle? The flight attendant, a tall woman with a tight bun and a name tag that read Brenda, leaned over the passenger seat. She didn't wait for an answer. She reached out with a hand adorned with sharp, polished nails and knocked the tablet right out of the hands of the young woman in seat 2A. The screen cracked with a loud, sickening snap. The young woman, Jordan Reeves, didn't move. She was 24 years old, wearing a simple gray hoodie and soft denim jeans. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail. She was currently holding a leather notebook and a pen, her posture perfectly relaxed despite the harsh environment of the first-class cabin. She was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech firm, a fact no one on this flight realized. Brenda stood over her, breathing hard, her eyes full of undisguised malice. She leaned down so low that her face was inches from Jordan. "You aren't a queen, sweetheart. You're just another passenger who needs to follow instructions. And honestly, you look like you don't even belong in this seat. I bet you're just some intern who stole a ticket." A few passengers nearby chuckled. The young woman in 2A had not moved. Her name was Jordan Reeves. She was 28 years old. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, dark trousers, and a pair of low black heels that she had set neatly under the seat in front of her when she sat down. Her carry-on was in the overhead bin, a slim black leather bag, no logo, the kind that costs more than most people's rent without advertising the fact. Her hair was natural, cut close on the sides, shaped carefully on top. She wore one ring on her right hand, a thin gold band her mother had given her. She wore no other jewelry. She had boarded the flight 40 minutes ago. She had taken her seat. She had opened her laptop. She had been working when Brenda Walsh appeared at her row and asked, in a tone that was not asking, whether Jordan was in the right seat. Jordan had shown her boarding pass. 2A. First class. Window. Brenda had looked at the boarding pass the way someone looks at something they have already decided is wrong. She said the seat had been reassigned. She said Jordan needed to move to economy. She said it in front of every first-class passenger in the forward cabin, 8 people in total, who were all now watching. Jordan said, calmly and quietly, that she had a confirmed first-class ticket and she was not moving. Brenda said she was going to need to check with the gate. Jordan said the gate was closed. The plane had pushed back. They were 37,000 feet in the air. Brenda said, "You need to watch your tone with me," Jordan said, still calm, still quiet. "I don't have a tone. I have a first-class ticket and a seat assignment, and I am sitting in it." And that was when Brenda Walsh raised her hand and brought it down across Jordan Reeves' face in front of 8 first-class passengers, 2 other flight attendants, and the cockpit crew who had left the door slightly ajar because they were running a systems check and the latch had not caught fully. Jordan did not gasp, did not grab her face, did not cry. She sat very still. Her left cheek was red. The mark of 4 fingers, visible from 3 feet away, rising in the recycled air of a pressurized cabin at cruising altitude. She reached up slowly and touched her face once with 2 fingers. Not theatrically. Just checking. Processing. Then she looked at Brenda Walsh with an expression that every single person in that cabin would remember for the rest of their lives. Not anger. Not devastation. Something far more quiet and far more dangerous than either of those things. Something that looked like a decision being made. Not one of those 8 first-class passengers knew who Jordan Reeves was. Not Brenda Walsh. Not the 2 other flight attendants who were standing frozen at the front galley watching. Not the pilot, Captain Steve Marks, who had heard the sound through the improperly latched cockpit door and was now sitting very still in his seat, wondering whether he had heard what he thought he heard. Not one person on that plane understood what was about to happen. None of them could have known that in exactly 12 minutes this flight was going to land. Not at JFK. Not at any scheduled destination. At the nearest available airport. because the woman sitting in 2A with the handprint on her face had the authority to make that happen. And she was going to use it. Have you ever been in a room or a plane or anywhere where someone looked right at you and decided you didn't belong? Before you opened your mouth, before you did a single thing wrong? Just because of what they saw? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from right now. And subscribe to Black Scars, because every story on this channel is about the moment they found out exactly who they were dealing with. Let me take you back, because you cannot understand what happened in that cabin without knowing who Jordan Reeves actually was. Jordan Reeves grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in southwest Atlanta on a street called Avon Avenue, 3 blocks from a dollar store and 6 blocks from the elementary school she walked to every morning by herself, starting at age 7 because her mother, a woman named Patricia Reeves, was already at work by the time Jordan needed to leave. Patricia worked the early shift at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, cleaning aircraft between flights for a contractor company called Service First. She started work at 4:30 in the morning and finished at 1 in the afternoon and came home smelling of cleaning solution and jet fuel and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been on their feet on a hard floor for 8 hours. She made $14.20 an hour for the first 6 years. Then she got a raise to $16 flat. She worked 6 days a week. She never called in sick because calling in sick meant losing the day's pay, and the day's pay was not optional. She kept every pay stub in a shoebox in the closet, the same way careful people who have learned that paper matters keep paper. She raised Jordan alone. Jordan's father had been in the picture for the first 3 years of Jordan's life, and then progressively less in the picture until he was not in the picture at all. Patricia did not spend energy being bitter about this. She spent energy on Jordan, on making sure Jordan had what she needed for school, on reading with her at night even when she was exhausted, on telling her, on a specific kind of morning when the apartment felt small and the world felt arranged against them, "Baby, the only ceiling in this house is the one I put there. And I didn't put one." Jordan was exceptional in school from the beginning. Not the kind of exceptional that needs to be coaxed out or encouraged into being. The kind that arrives already running and just needs someone to open the door. She was reading at a 4th grade level in 1st grade. She was doing algebra in middle school without being taught it formally, just because she had found a textbook in the school library and wanted to know how it worked. She won a citywide math competition at 12 and a regional science competition at 13, and received a full academic scholarship to a private high school in Buckhead called Meridian Academy, where she was one of 11 black students in a school of 430. She did not shrink. She did not perform smallness to make anyone comfortable. She showed up every day in the clothes her mother had carefully selected from the consignment store on Cascade Road, and she sat in the front row and she answered every question, and she asked the ones nobody else was asking, and she graduated second in her class and went to Georgia Tech on a full merit scholarship and graduated with a degree in aerospace engineering and a minor in business finance in 3 years and 8 months, which was not the fastest that had ever been done, but was close. Then she did something that surprised everyone who thought they had her trajectory mapped. She did not go to work for an aerospace firm. She did not take the Boeing interview that her advisor had practically arranged. She went to work for a regional airline, a small carrier operating out of Atlanta called Skybridge Air, as a junior operations analyst at $41,000 a year. Her colleagues assumed she was building towards something traditional. They were right about that part. What they did not anticipate was the speed. By 22, she was a senior analyst. By 24, she was directing operations strategy. By 26, she had identified a structural inefficiency in the way Skybridge managed its fleet maintenance contracts that was costing the company $3.2 million a year, proposed a restructuring solution, implemented it personally, and saved the company $3.1 million in the first year alone. The CEO at the time, a man named Robert Whitfield, had called her into his office after the first year results came in and said, "What do you want?" She said, "A seat at the table." He said, "Done." She was 26 years old, and she was on the executive committee of a regional airline. Then, 2 things happened close together that changed everything. The first was that Robert Whitfield decided to retire. He was 68, and he had been running the airline for 19 years, and his knees hurt, and his wife wanted to travel somewhere that wasn't Atlanta. He began the process of identifying a successor. The second was that a private equity group based in Charlotte that had been quietly accumulating a minority stake in Skybridge for 2 years decided to move on a majority acquisition. They made an offer. The board considered it. Jordan spent 3 weeks building a counterproposal, a restructured ownership model that would allow the company to remain independent while bringing in the capital it needed for fleet expansion. She presented it to the board on a Thursday morning in September with a 94 slide deck and 4 years of projections built on data she had pulled herself. The board approved her model. They rejected the PE acquisition. They offered Jordan the CEO position the same afternoon. She was 27 years old. She said yes before they finished the sentence. 6 months after becoming CEO, she completed a secondary transaction that the financial press had not fully understood when it was announced. A private purchase, structured through a holding company, of a 23% stake in the aircraft leasing portfolio that included several of the planes in Skybridge's fleet. It was a complex deal, handled quietly, disclosed in the required filings in language that was accurate but not written to draw attention. What it meant, in plain terms, was that Jordan Reeves personally owned a financial interest in several of the aircraft operated by her airline, including the Boeing 737-800 that was currently operating as Delta Flight 1147 on a code-share arrangement, including the specific aircraft that was currently at 37,000 feet above Virginia with a handprint rising on Jordan Reeves' left cheek. She had not mentioned this to Brenda Walsh. She had not mentioned it to Captain Steve Marks. She had not mentioned it to anyone on that plane because there had been no reason to mention it until approximately 4 minutes ago. There was a reason now. Jordan sat in seat 2A for 1 full minute after the slap. The cabin was completely silent. The 2 other flight attendants, a young woman named Cassie Vance and a man named David Park, had not moved from the front galley. David's hand was over his mouth. Cassie was looking at the floor. A man in seat 1B, a heavy-set white man in a blue suit named Greg Patterson, who was a pharmaceutical sales director from Atlanta and who had watched the entire exchange from 18 inches away, said, "Someone should," and then did not finish the sentence. No one finished it for him. The man in seat 3A, across the aisle and 1 row back, a man named Michael Torres, who was a contractor traveling for work, had his phone halfway out of his pocket and then put it back. He looked at the window, then at his hands. A woman named Sandra Wells, seat 2B, middle seat next to Jordan, had her eyes closed. She was gripping the armrest. She was not asleep. She was doing what people do when something terrible is happening, close enough to touch them, and they have decided they cannot afford to be involved. Brenda Walsh had stepped back 1 step. She was looking at Jordan with an expression that was recalibrating. The satisfaction was still there, but something underneath it had shifted slightly because Jordan had not done what Brenda had expected her to do. She had expected tears, or outrage, or pleading, or the kind of flustered, frightened response that Brenda had learned over 22 years could be managed and explained away and ultimately used against the person having it. What she was looking at instead was a woman who was very, very still. Jordan closed her laptop. She set it on the seat beside her. She straightened her blazer. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and took out her phone. She dialed a number. It rang twice. A man answered. His name was Marcus Webb. He was the chief legal officer of Skybridge Air, which meant he was also, by structural extension, counsel to the holding entity that owned Jordan's aircraft leasing stake. He answered because Jordan's name on his screen at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday meant something required his immediate attention. She said, "Marcus, I need you to pull up the registration on Sierra Bravo 7741 and confirm the ownership structure for me verbally right now." There was a brief pause, the sound of a keyboard. Marcus said, "SB Aviation Holdings, LLC. Primary beneficial owner, Jordan A. Reeves, 23% direct. Held through the Reeves Family Trust. You're looking at the aircraft currently code-sharing as Delta 1147. Jordan said, "Yes." Marcus said, "Is everything okay?" Jordan said, "Pull up the operational authority provisions in the leasing agreement." Specifically, Section 14, Subsection C. I need you ready to act on them. There was silence on the line, the sound of pages moving. Marcus said, slowly, Jordan. What happened? She said, I'll explain everything in about 15 minutes. Be ready. She ended the call. She stood up. She was 5 feet 7 inches tall, and she was standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin at 37,000 feet, and every person in that cabin, including Brenda Walsh, was looking at her. Brenda said, You need to sit down. We are at cruising altitude, and... My name, Jordan said, quiet and clear, is Jordan Reeves. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Skybridge Air. I am also, through Skybridge's holding structure, a beneficial owner of this aircraft. She paused for exactly 1 second. I need you to step aside. The silence in that cabin was total. Brenda blinked. I don't know what you think. You struck me, Jordan said, across the face, in front of 8 witnesses. In a cabin, you are responsible for managing professionally. And before that, you attempted to remove me from a confirmed first-class seat with a valid boarding pass. She held Brenda's gaze without blinking. Step aside, please. Brenda did not step aside, but she also did not say another word, because something in her had finally registered what she was looking at, and what she was looking at was not what she had believed it was when she raised her hand. Jordan walked past her to the cockpit door. She knocked twice, firmly. Captain Steve Marks opened it. He was 51 years old, 24 years of flying, not a man who was easily rattled. He looked at Jordan. He looked at the mark on her face. He looked at Brenda Walsh standing in the aisle behind Jordan. His expression moved through several things in a short period of time. Jordan said, Captain Marks, I need 2 minutes of your time. He stepped aside and let her in. What happened in that cockpit over the following 4 minutes was not recorded in the cockpit voice recorder because the CVR only captures audio during specific operational phases, and the plane was at cruise. But Captain Marks described it later in his formal statement, and what he described was this. Jordan Reeves entered the cockpit. She identified herself by name. She showed him identification on her phone. A corporate ID and a document confirmation from Marcus Webb that had arrived as a secure message during the 30 seconds between ending her call and walking to the cockpit. She explained, in 3 clear sentences, what had happened in the cabin. She told him she was invoking the owner authority provisions of the leasing agreement, which permitted the beneficial owner to require a diversion for safety-related incidents. She said she was declaring the cabin environment compromised by a crew conduct incident. She said she needed him to divert to the nearest suitable airport. Captain Marks said, Ma'am, I need to, Jordan said. Captain, I understand your obligations. I am not asking you to override safety protocol. I am invoking a contractual provision you can verify in the next 90 seconds. The number for my legal counsel is on the document you're looking at. He looked at the document. He looked at the number. He called it. Marcus Webb answered on the first ring and confirmed everything Jordan had said in the clear, measured voice of a man who had been waiting for the call. Captain Marks ended the call. He looked at his first officer, a young man named Daniel Cho, 29 years old, who had not said one word since Jordan walked in and who was looking very carefully at the instrument panel. Captain Marks got on the radio. He declared a cabin crew conduct diversion and requested priority routing to Roanoke Regional Airport in Virginia, 43 miles south of their current position. The controller acknowledged. Captain Marks began the diversion. The announcement came over the cabin speakers 11 minutes after the slap. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Marks. We will be making an unscheduled landing at Roanoke Regional Airport due to a cabin incident. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 22 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We apologize for the inconvenience. The cabin erupted, not in fear, in confusion and noise and the immediate chaos of 43 people pulling out their phones and looking at each other and asking questions that nobody in the cabin had answers to yet, except Brenda Walsh. Brenda Walsh was standing in the aisle, and she had heard the announcement, and she had heard the specific words, cabin incident, And she knew, with the particular clarity of someone watching the floor fall out beneath them, exactly what those words meant and what they were going to mean next. She looked at Jordan, who had returned from the cockpit and was seated back in 2A with her laptop open and her phone in her hand and the mark still visible on her cheek. And for the first time since she had boarded this flight, Brenda Walsh felt something she had not felt in 22 years of doing exactly what she wanted in the air. She felt afraid. Cassie Vance, the younger flight attendant, had moved to the back galley. She was sitting on the jump seat with her hands in her lap. She looked, later, like someone who had known for a long time that something like this was coming for Brenda Walsh and had not known what to do about it and was now watching it arrive. David Park was in the front galley. He was looking at the floor. The man in seat 1B, Greg Patterson, the pharmaceutical director, leaned across the aisle toward Jordan and said, "Excuse me? Did you? Are you the reason we're landing?" Jordan looked at him briefly. "Yes," he said. "What did she do exactly? I saw it, but I want to make sure Can I give a statement somewhere?" Jordan said, "Yes. There will be someone to take statements when we land." Greg Patterson sat back. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Brenda Walsh. Then he looked at his phone and began typing something. A note, or a text, or a statement he was already preparing because he was suddenly very clear about which side of this situation he wanted his name on. Michael Torres, the contractor in 3A, had his phone out now. He was reviewing something on his screen. He was reading, Jordan would learn later, a news alert that someone had already posted. A passenger in economy who had heard the announcement and had been told by a flight attendant that there had been an incident in first class and had already posted a 30-second video clip that included audio of the slap. The clip had 12,000 views before the plane touched down in Roanoke. Sandra Wells, seat 2B, had opened her eyes. She was looking at Jordan. She said nothing, but she had stopped gripping the armrest. The plane landed at Roanoke Regional at 11:14 in the morning. There were 2 airport security officers waiting at the gate. There was a woman from Delta's regional operations team named Christine Hall who had driven from the Delta facilities office and arrived 7 minutes before the plane landed because Jordan's legal team had called Delta's corporate operations line within minutes of the diversion being declared and had explained in precise terms what had occurred and what documentation existed and what they would require from Delta in the next 60 minutes. Christine Hall had made 4 phone calls in her car on the way to the gate. She arrived looking like someone who had received information she wished she had received differently. The passengers deplaned. Most of them filed out with the particular stunned energy of people who had been on a flight that became a news story while they were on it. Several of them had phones out. Several of them were already on calls. The economy cabin passengers were confused and tired and asking questions of the gate agents that the gate agents were not yet authorized to answer. Jordan came off last. She walked to Christine Hall and they shook hands, and Christine said, "Miss Reeves." "I am so sorry," Jordan said. "Let's find somewhere to talk." They walked to a private office near the gate. In that office, over the next 40 minutes, several things were settled. The first, the formal incident report was filed, Jordan's statement. The statements of 8 first-class passengers, 6 of whom came forward voluntarily and 2 of whom were asked. The statements documented the seat dispute. They documented the slap. They documented the sequence of events with the clarity that 8 independent witnesses who have seen the same thing from different angles can provide when the thing they saw was unambiguous. The second, Delta's regional operations manager, a man named Paul Sheridan, who was on a conference call from Charlotte, confirmed that Delta's code share agreement with Skybridge included provisions regarding crew conduct that triggered specific consequences for confirmed incidents of passenger physical contact. What Brenda Walsh had done was not a gray area. It was not a situation that required interpretation. It was a confirmed physical assault on a passenger. Brenda Walsh was removed from active flight duty effective immediately pending a formal investigation. She was escorted to a separate area by airport security. She had not said very much since the plane landed. She had said, once, to one of the security officers, she was being disrespectful. The officer had written this down without comment. Captain Steve Marks had filed his diversion report and was cooperating fully with the investigation. He was not disciplined. He had done exactly what the situation required and what the documentation supported. He sat in the pilot lounge and drank a cup of coffee and looked at nothing in particular. What happened with Captain Marks next was not what Jordan had planned. It was not something she had requested. But it happened because of what came out of the investigation in the following 24 hours. When Delta's operations team pulled Brenda Walsh's personnel file, they found something. A complaint filed 14 months earlier by a passenger on a flight from Miami to Atlanta. The passenger had been a young black woman traveling alone in first class. She had reported that a flight attendant had questioned her seat assignment, used dismissive language, and made comments that she described in the complaint as racially discriminatory. The complaint had been reviewed. Brenda Walsh had provided a response. The response had been accepted. The file had been closed. There was a second complaint, 8 months before the first. A similar pattern. Different flight. Different passenger. Same description. Both complaints were from black women in first class. Both had been closed. The Delta operations team pulled all complaints associated with Brenda Walsh's employee ID over a 22-year period. They found 7 complaints in total, 5 of them from black passengers, 4 of those 5 from black women in first-class seats. When Jordan's legal team received this information, they were very quiet for a moment. Then Marcus Webb said, "We're going to need to expand the scope of this." He called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Department of Transportation's Aviation Consumer Protection Division before the end of the business day. The investigation was no longer just about the slap. Now, let me tell you where everyone ended up, because the aftermath of a moment like this does not fit in a single afternoon. It spreads. It moves through people the way water moves through ground, finding every crack, filling every space, changing the landscape in ways you do not fully see until you look back from a distance. Brenda Walsh was terminated from Delta Airlines 31 days after the incident, following the completion of the formal investigation. The investigation confirmed the 2 prior complaints, reviewed her conduct record, and concluded that the pattern represented a sustained failure to meet Delta's non-discrimination standards. Her attorney issued a statement saying she intended to contest the termination. The statement did not address the 7 complaints in her file. The footage from the cabin. 3 different phones had captured portions of what happened, and the clearest clip had 460,000 views by the end of the first week. Was entered into the investigation record as corroborating evidence. The clip did not require narration. It was what it was, and anyone who watched it understood what it was. She also faced a separate civil action filed by Jordan's legal team for the physical assault. That case was in process when this story ends. What was clear was that Brenda Walsh would not be in the air again. 22 years of service. Ended in a first-class cabin at 37,000 feet over Virginia because she looked at a young woman in a blazer and made a decision about who that woman was before she knew one thing about her. She had been wrong about every single part of it. Captain Steve Marks kept his job. His handling of the diversion was reviewed and found to be correct, professional, and appropriately executed. His evaluation noted that he had responded to a documented safety-related incident with the right protocol and the right paperwork and the right calls. He was not celebrated for this because he had simply done what the situation required. But he was not penalized, and he continued flying. He said one thing in his formal statement that was noted by the investigation team. He said, "When Miss Reeves spoke to me in the cockpit, she was calm and she was precise and she had documentation and she was right about every single thing she told me. I have been in this cockpit for 24 years and I have learned that the people who are right tend to sound a very specific way." She sounded that way. David Park, the male flight attendant who had stood in the front galley with his hand over his mouth and had not intervened during the incident, submitted a voluntary statement to the investigation. He said he had known about previous complaints against Brenda Walsh. He said he had witnessed what he described as a pattern of behavior towards specific passengers over the years they had worked together. He said he had told himself it was not his place. He said, in the statement, that he understood now that it had been his place and that his silence had cost something. He was not terminated. He was required to complete additional training. He cooperated fully with the expanded investigation into Walsh's prior complaints. His cooperation was noted in the file. He said in his statement, "I stayed quiet because I thought quiet was the safe choice. I understand now that quiet was not safe for the passengers she was doing this to. I should have said something a long time ago." Cassie Vance, the younger flight attendant, had filed her own voluntary statement within 2 hours of landing. Her statement was specific, detailed, and damning. She described not just the incident on Flight 1147, but 2 other specific incidents she had personally witnessed involving Brenda Walsh and black passengers that she had not previously reported. She said, "I was afraid of what it would cost me professionally. I know that is not a good enough reason. I am saying it now because I want the record to include what I saw." Her statement was one of the most significant pieces of the investigation into the prior complaints. It provided corroboration that the independent passenger complaints had not had. It helped close the evidentiary gap that had allowed the previous complaints to be dismissed. She kept her job. She was not penalized. She said in a follow-up interview with Angela Morris, yes, the same Angela Morris, who had covered the Jordan Reeves story for the Tribune and who had been following Jordan's work since the Skybridge restructuring, that she had lost sleep over the 2 incidents she had not reported. She said, "I am going to have to live with that, but I am not going to repeat it. Ever." Greg Patterson, the pharmaceutical director in Seat 1B, gave a full statement. He gave it quickly and without being asked twice. He was thorough, accurate, and consistent. He described exactly what he had seen from 18 inches away. He said in his statement, "What she did was wrong. It was clearly wrong. I knew it was wrong when it happened. I am not proud of the fact that I did not say something in the moment. I am saying it now as clearly as I can." He also posted publicly about what he had witnessed. The post was specific and factual and received significant attention because Greg Patterson had 43,000 followers on LinkedIn and because what he described matched the video clips that were already circulating. His post was shared 11,000 times in 48 hours. He had not done anything in the moment. He had watched. He had started a sentence and not finished it. He was doing what he could afterward, which was better than some people do and less than the moment had required. He seemed to understand both of those things. Michael Torres, the contractor in 3A, who had put his phone back in his pocket during the incident, gave a statement. He was factual and brief. He did not elaborate on what he had or had not done in the moment. He had nothing to elaborate. He had watched. That was the whole of his involvement. He had one more thing happen. 3 weeks after the Roanoke landing, he was on a different flight, a short domestic hop from Atlanta to Nashville, and he watched a flight attendant speak to an older black man in economy in a tone that Michael Torres recognized. The particular dismissive certainty of someone who has made a decision about who they are dealing with before asking a single question. Michael Torres got up from his seat and walked to the front of the cabin and said to the flight attendant, "I want to make sure I understand what's happening here." He said it calmly. He said it clearly. He said it in front of 4 other passengers who were watching. The tone changed. The situation resolved. The older man was left alone. Michael Torres went back to his seat. He did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as someone who had been in Roanoke and had learned something and was now trying to do something useful with it. That is what most change actually looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not photogenic. Just a person deciding that this time they are going to say something and then saying it. The Department of Transportation investigation into Delta's handling of prior complaints resulted in a formal finding that the complaint closure process had been inadequate in multiple cases and that the pattern of passenger complaints had not triggered the escalation protocols that should have been triggered. Delta was required to review and revise its complaint investigation procedures and to submit to an audit of complaint handling practices covering the prior 5 years. The finding was not a fine. It was a structural requirement. The kind of consequence that is less visible than money but lasts longer. Delta issued a public statement that included an apology to Jordan Reeves by name. The statement was 312 words, and Jordan's legal team reviewed it before release. Jordan accepted the apology publicly in 2 sentences. She said, I appreciate the statement. The policy changes matter more. Jordan Reeves was back in Atlanta by Thursday of the same week. She had a board meeting at 9 in the morning on Thursday, and she was on time for it. She walked in wearing the same kind of charcoal blazer she had been wearing on the plane, sat at the head of the table, and opened the meeting by saying, "Before we get into the agenda, I want to share something I learned this week about how our code share partners handle passenger complaints." She presented a summary of what she had found in the Delta investigation records regarding the prior complaints. She presented it as a business operations question. What should Skybridge's standards be, and how should those standards be enforced in code share arrangements? The board discussed it for 40 minutes. By the end of the meeting, they had approved a new clause for all code share agreements. Any complaint of racially discriminatory conduct by crew members on aircraft operated under Skybridge arrangements would trigger mandatory escalation to Skybridge's own oversight committee. Not discretionary. Mandatory. It was a small thing in the full scale of how aviation operated. It was a real thing. It would reach the next person the way these changes reach people. Quietly, in advance, before the incident rather than after, which is the only way a policy change actually protects anyone. Jordan did one more thing. She waited until the investigations were complete and the findings were documented and the record was fully built. Then she called her mother. Patricia Reeves was home in the Southwest Atlanta apartment. A different apartment than the one on Avon Avenue, a nicer one in a better-maintained building that Jordan had helped her move into 3 years earlier. She was sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee. She answered on the second ring. Jordan told her the whole story. From the boarding pass to the cockpit to Roanoke to the investigation findings. All of it. It took 25 minutes. Patricia was quiet for a long moment when Jordan finished. Then she said, "You know what I thought about when you were telling me that?" Jordan said, "What?" Patricia said, "I used to clean those planes. I spent 8 years cleaning first class, every morning, before the passengers got on, before anybody was watching." She paused. "I used to look at those first class seats, and I used to think about the people who sat in them. And one morning I thought, that's going to be my daughter one day, sitting in one of those seats. Not because of who her father is or who her family is, because of what she built." Jordan did not say anything. Patricia said, "And then I went back to cleaning because I had 4 more planes to finish before 7. Jordan sat with that for a moment. Her mother in the dark at 4:30 in the morning cleaning the seats. The shoebox of pay stubs in the closet. The walk to school. The front row. The textbook she found herself in the library. She said, "Mom, I own the plane." Patricia laughed. Not a small laugh. A full one. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and real and has been waiting for exactly the right moment. She said, "I know, baby. I know you do. I want to say something directly to you. If you have ever walked into a first-class seat that you earned, that you paid for, that belongs to you by every measure that matters, and someone looked at you and decided before you spoke that you were in the wrong place, I need you to know that your boarding pass is real. What you built is real. The seat is yours. You do not have to explain yourself to someone who has already decided not to hear the explanation. And if you have been on that plane, sitting in your seat, watching something happen in the aisle, holding your phone halfway up and putting it back down, the next flight is coming. The next moment is yours. What you do with it is the only answer you can give to what you didn't do before." Patricia Reeves spent 8 years cleaning first-class cabins at 4:30 in the morning on a hard airport floor. She kept every pay stub in a shoebox. She told her daughter there was no ceiling. She was right. Some people look at a young black woman in a charcoal blazer and they see a maid in the wrong seat. They should have looked closer. If you know someone who is building something right now, quietly, before sunrise, without anyone watching yet, share this story with them. Because sometimes the most important thing a person needs is to know that someone who started exactly where they started ended up owning the plane. This has been Black Scars.